We are online. We are recording. This is Generous Theology with Chuck and Brock, and I am so happy to be here talking with my good friend, Chuck. And Chuck, we have a very pleasant task here tonight. We're looking through Chapter 7, The Scientific Foundations, from Bavinck's Part 3, Foundations of Dogmatic Theology, from his Volume 1, Prolegomena, in his 4 volumes of Reformed Dogmatics. Now, Chuck, that's a beautiful way to lay out where we're at. And I want to say, last time you and I talked about this chapter at a high-level overview, setting things up so that we could then get into the meat of Bavinck's material. And we had a surprising lot of backstory to go through. But I think we got to a place where we can get into Bavinck's material here now. And I'll just share with you up front, Chuck, that I think this one chapter could be a graduate level course, the scientific foundations for Reformed dogmatic. If you were to just extract one chapter from this entire volume to move with, to run with, that would set out this very cornerstone of Reformed theology, I think this one chapter might be my choice there, and for some reasons that we're going to get into. And as we get in here, Chuck, I think I'm just going to state the problem as Bavinck states it, and then check in with you about it. Bavinck opens. Now, this is the summarization of Bavinck's text. So, for those of you who don't have Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, each chapter has a summarization that is a high-level synopsis or an abstract of the chapter itself, and from there, the text, Bavinck's text of the chapter, then proceeds from it. So I think this is actually written by Professor Bolt and John Vrind, the translator, and the other members of the Translation Society, as opposed to being from Bavinck himself. But I find these abstracts to be superlatively helpful, really excellent. Now, here's the problem Bavinck is trying to solve, and I'm reading from the abstract here in Chapter 7. It says, if we consider theology a science, we must inquire into the scientific foundations of its structure. In the modern era, this was a task usually given to philosophy, an illusory starting point, since then dogmatic theology has no independent scientific status of its own. Normatively, theology should begin with revelation, proceed from faith, and articulate its own first principles. And the Latin word here is principia. So, Chuck, this is Bavinck stating the task that he proposes to solve throughout his 4 volumes of the Reformed Dogmatics. Under what statements can we actually consider theology a science? And these foundations are really the architecture of the structure that's going to keep this edifice up. Or if there's a problem, of course, then it's where a critic is going to focus and attack, and of course with good reasons. Does this statement, Chuck, in your mind, convey what's at stake, as well as maybe also give some insight into the plan of attack that Bavinck is going to use?
Yeah, I think it does. I know you and I, this is not the first time we've gone through a Bavinck, writings of Bavinck. You and I had gone through Reformed Ethics as well, at least the first volume of it. And I think we had a similar conversation at that time, although it was long enough ago that I think both of us perhaps have an even greater understanding of some of what's at issue here. But there's first the question, is theology a science? And of course, there are those who would argue that it is not, because they would only give the label of a science to those things that meet certain first principles about how you study them, whether it's the scientific method of doing empirically what you're trying to study. Others would have an issue with anything that has connection to faith being in any way a science. They want to draw a line between faith and science. Those who do want to consider it a science, though, there are other issues as well, including the fact that there are many who have, and that theology is a kind of science, but they wish to give to it foundational principles for the study of theology as a science that are no different than the study of other sciences. And the truth is that different types of endeavors of study do come with different first principles, different basic ideas of how one determines those first principles. And for some reason, it seems, for some reason, we'll get into a little bit of that, I think, but for some very specific reasons, there are those who wish to deny that to theology and in many ways try to truncate it by treating it as no different than, say, psychology or literature. And what Bavinck is saying here is that no, he does accept the idea that what we're dealing with here is a science, that one can study theology and dogmatics as a science, but in doing that, we need to be clear about those first principles. And among those first principles include the idea that, all that we can learn about God comes to us through revelation, that we have the ability to appropriate knowledge about God, but we only have that ability through a childlike faith. And that's very different than the way that we might approach the study of calculus or the way that we approach the study of psychology, for example. And Bavinck, I think, is making the point that it is entirely appropriate to have these first principles for the study of dogmatics that are different than for the study of other things. And not only is it appropriate, but it is also necessary because it is a different area of study. And so he defends, I think, both of those principles, both that there can be and that there should be different principles, different first principles for studying theology. What about you? What do you think? What is Bavinck catching a lot of the important issues here? Is he laid out in a way that was helpful to you? Sort of what's at stake in making these statements about theology as a science? Are you concerned in any way that Bavinck moves in that direction and is willing to consider theology and dogmatics in as a science, even if it is not exactly the same as other types of science?
Thank you, my friend, for opening it up in that way. The reason why I'm grateful for that is because it gives us a chance to talk about Bavinck is not only saying what a Christian dogmatics is in its scientific understanding, but he's also implicitly contrasting it with the other common modern way that people look at what it means to be a science. And so you and I have talked about this arch of Aristotelian logic. And if you think of the St. Louis arch, you can really get a helpful visualization for what's going on here. And in the Geisteswissenschaften, in the Vienna School of Thinking, in the liberal arts, the humanities that have come to us from the Schleiermachian and Kantian revolutions, we see that everything is built around, just like the arch at St. Louis has two foundations. So you have the arch, which peaks in the middle, up in the air, but down at the bottom of each of the two places where the arch comes in contact with the ground, you have this idea of inductive generalizations, building to an inductive logic. And that inductive logic leads to this intuitive grasp of self-evident first principles. And then coming up from the other side and meeting up in the middle is this idea of deductive logic. And these are the first principles of demonstration. And so people start with premises, move towards conclusions. They start with beliefs and move towards reasons. And so the modern liberal humanities, in some sense, really seems to be encapsulated well by thinking of the mind, the human mind, as basing its scientific knowledge on an inductive or empirical or experience-related way of thinking and interacting in reality, and then a principle of mind, of rationalism, of reason, if you want to put it that way. And so Bavinck is going to contrast implicitly his system with this Geisteswissenschaft, and that is extremely helpful. Now, here's Bavinck's better description. He says that, normatively, theology as a science should begin with revelation. Now, interestingly enough, that's a step that is missing from how most moderns characterize science in modern conception. So people in modern conceptions of science proceed from these ideas about reality that they presume or presuppose or wish to start with without demonstration. And then they want to build from those properly basic ideas and then come into these ideas of what it means to be, what it means to have existence, and what it means to have knowledge in reality. Now, Bavinck says that theology should begin with revelation, but I think we have to note that science, as a science, regardless of whether it's theology or not, has to begin with some sort of revelation. Chuck, there's no position, there's no way for a disembodied spirit, that one that lacks a connection with a universe, to perform any sort of scientific inquiry. And because of that, one first needs a universe, and that universe needs to reveal things about itself to the observing subject. So in that sense, I see Bavinck's model here as perhaps being even better than this Aristotelian arch. Now, the second thing Bavinck mentions here is proceeds from faith. Well, what's that mean? I think we can get a great first approximation by referring to this idea of principia or axioms. And what does that mean? Well, that just means that in order to produce outputs, Chuck, you have to first have inputs. And the first inputs cannot be the result of previous outputs, for if they are the previous outputs, then they're not inputs in an ultimate sense. And so you have to terminate the regress of reasons. And the way that you do this, of course, is that you have to start with some quantities that are axiomatic. That is to say, they're beyond demonstration. And this is somewhat similar to what Christians say when we say that knowledge about God and about ourselves proceeds from faith. And then Bavinck finishes with this final point. It must articulate its own first principles. Now, these are the principles by which the universe is to make sense to us. Chuck, if, for example, you and I lived in a universe that was simply like the successive images in an old analog movie reel. So you remember how the old pre-digital movies used to be made. You had these long strips of film, and the film would be shot into sequences of frames. And you would run those frames at what I think 24 frames per second was the movie standard there for many years, 24 frames per second. And so what would happen is you would have those 24 frames, each second would represent successive events. Now, if we were in a universe that was like that, and there was no continuity between frame 1 and frame 2, no continuity between frame 2 and frame 3, why then that's what white noise looks like. So white noise, if you remember the old in the 70s and the 80s, and maybe even up into the 90s, you could turn on a television under the old analog system, and stations that had ceased broadcasting for the night would not have a signal. And so if you would turn the TV on, your receiver would register nothing but what's called white noise, which is to say just the absence of a signal. And there's nothing being broadcast. You just have these random black and white patterns coming through. And if that were what reality would be like without any continuity in between the succeeding events in history, well, then we could have no scientific knowledge. So what has to happen is we start to notice that successive events in history, just like the frames in the old style analog film, have some continuity. Now, I say some continuity because, of course, if you look at a roll of movie film, you'll find you'll have hundreds of frames in a particular roll of film that corresponds to a certain scene. And that scene is the image of, let's just say, two particular actors acting a sequence out. The frame is focused in on their two faces, and they're delivering their dialogue over the course of several minutes. Well, you have this continuity in the picture. You have a continuity of the background, you have a continuity of the subject, and you have this continuity that goes until the scene changes. And then, of course, the camera angle shifts, the scene changes, and maybe we move from the dialogue between these two people into something that's that's discontinuous. Let's say maybe it's a move on the camera outside of the place where they were in, and it's taking a look at the scene outside. So you have a discontinuity. And yet there are some underlying principles that allow us to have and say things about the successive sequences of events. Now, Chuck, I apologize. That was a long detour, but the whole idea is that without these principia, there's no reason to think that what is happening in the universe is any different from just watching a television screen with that old style white noise. But the fact is that reality does seem to give us this idea that there are these principles, these principia that make all the difference and make things far from arbitrary. And so Bavinck's pointing this out. Now he's going to give us 3 fundamental principles here, and they're going to correspond with this idea of existence, of internal understanding and internal understanding. And we could use the Latin there if it would help. But the point is Bavinck is talking about this in a way that I think is going to be superior when all is said and done to what is commonly called the quote unquote scientific method in that liberal humanities. Now, Chuck, I got into the weeds there, and I apologize for that. Did we make any progress there moving the ball forward? And what are your thoughts with respect to some of those things?
I think we did. I think these are important basic considerations. I think there is a sense in which it feels like we get into the weeds on some of these things, but these are weeds I think we have to chop through, because if we ignore them, I think we ignore them to our peril, because they really are very basic to how we do what we do in studying dogmatics and studying theology. And I think the danger of not getting into the weeds, and maybe it isn't that we're getting into the weeds, we're just wading into a particular part of the river that maybe is a part of the river that some people don't always get to. But I think to get into that part of the river is important, because if we don't, we don't know the source of the decisions that we make. We have a greater tendency, I think, to take on ideas of others uncritically without necessarily measuring them against what perhaps other Christians and perhaps principles that are basic to Scripture. And I think also then even if we don't have a tendency to buy into those things, if we don't understand the reason why do we have, what are our first principles, it makes it much more difficult then, I think, to really present what it is that we're doing. Before we got on the air, we were talking a little bit about and what are the principles that we use for teaching concepts, theological concepts that certainly are permanent ideas that we believe that they're scriptural, and therefore God breathed, and therefore they're permanent ideas that are unchanging. But how do we present them in a world that is changing? How do we present them to people whose understanding of things and who the language they use is always changing? And if we don't understand sort of these first principles, it's also, I think, possible to just simply become disconnected and no longer be able to present our ideas in a way that can be understood. I think there's occasionally, I don't want to throw anybody in particular under the bus, but I do think that there is sometimes a tendency in our Reformed world to get so caught up in our language and our way of talking about, and perhaps not thinking about those first principles, not taking on other principles necessarily, but not really thinking about how we apply those first principles in talking about the concepts and ideas that we want to talk about, that we're no longer able to present them to the world at large. The world at large no longer even has the ability to understand the language that we're using. And I think that's an alternate danger. It's different than the danger of just simply taking over others' ideas and others' first principles, but it is still a concern. So I think this is really important. And by the way, one of the things that I found really interesting just in this this very first section, is Bavinck, I think, is even tracing some of this. He talks about how even folks like Ritschl and Frank, who we and Bavinck as well certainly have some great differences with, but he also points out how even some of their ideas were rightly in opposition to some of the ideas of sort of a natural theology or a rationalistic philosophical theology, such as was promoted by Schleiermacher. And he points out that Ritschl and Frank and others really wanted to get away from that correctly because they understood that you can't have religion and a natural theology in a way that rationalism conceives it. It just doesn't exist because we don't acquire the knowledge of this religion of natural theology apart from special revelation. We need to account for the light of Scripture. We need to account for the work of the Holy Spirit. And to just simply take on some of these scientific concepts and apply them as our first principles is problematic. Now, Bavinck is going to talk about where he feels, and he has already, where he feels people like Ritschl have gone in the wrong direction. But it is interesting to me that even in drawing out some of the historical context here, Bavinck is looking at some of what was happening during his era in reaction to sort of the late 19th century willingness by folks like Schleiermacher to take on a philosophical theology, as Bavinck calls it.
Chuck, that's so, and we have to consider we're asking metaphysical questions, and metaphysical questions, generally speaking, are a superset of scientific questions. In other words, while scientific statements may be metaphysical statements are a superset of scientific statements. And so the one thing that we hear over and over again is requests for demonstration, requests for proof. And when you come to an ultimate level of reality, you come to a place where past which science can no longer go. And that is really important to say. So things like, am I a disembodied mind or am I a brain in a vat, to articulate the famous philosophical question? It's not a question that can be answered scientifically under modern phenomenalism. If one is a brain in a vat, one could not possibly start with a starting point of self and reason outward to that. It's the old statement. What was the nursery rhyme, Chuck, that we grew up with? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 merrily. Life is but a dream. Chuck, right now, as you and I speak, as we record this session, are we living in the universe, in a reality, or are we living in a dream? And the truth is, while you and I may suppose we have some strong reasons to think one way or the other, the truth is the answer is not one that can be arrived at from a scientific method or can be reasoned to with a scientific certainty. Rather, instead, unproved principles about the underlying nature of reality fill a role in seeding, and seed here, S-E-E-D, seeding our understanding. And so this is why there's such a distinction between, for example, let me just throw a classic case out there, between creationism versus evolutionism. And the question is more complicated than I want to get into here, but this idea is when you talk with people who believe in some form of evolution, macroevolution, you have this idea that things, especially life forms, are not purposefully guided throughout their existence in history. So things instead of having a purposeful guidance, instead of being governed by an overarching lawgiver or governor, instead you have this idea that things just happen arbitrarily and through time and chance with luck. And from that, Chuck, if you own that, if that seeds, and seed, S-E-E-D, if you plant a seed of this time and chance-ism in your mind, then that will completely shape your understanding of reality in a way different than somebody who plants a different seed. Say, for example, a creationist who plants this seed in his mind that reality is God is the essential foundation underlying all of reality, purposeful being, one who governs and designs and creates and provides for and sustains. And Chuck, from those seeds that are planted in the human mind will come very different worldviews. And in some sense, this is God's explanation for the nature of reality and why people are the way they are today. What do I mean by that? Well, through the Bible, we talk about humankind being fallen creatures. We are sinners. We have become lost. We've lost our way. We are alienated from God. Now, we need to talk about what all that means, and we need to properly and carefully qualify it. But at the very short end is this understanding that because of sin, there is a fog of ignorance, as well as not simply ignorance, but willful rebellion. This fog of willful rebellion clouds the intellect of the perceiving human subject in such a way that he looks and he can't see the God who underlies every aspect of reality. And so we're talking about scientific foundations, but in order to talk about a scientific foundation, we first have to get to a metaphysical foundation that even precedes that. And that's the point here. So Bavinck gives us three fundamental principles. First is the principle of being. God is the essential foundation underlying all of reality. Now, on top of that, we have this revelatory principle. Scripture is the external cognitive foundation. And that means that with respect to knowledge about God, the Holy Scriptures are God's primary tool of revelation. And then finally, how is it that the knowledge in the Holy Scriptures comes to us? Well, there's an internal principle of knowing. That is to say, God, the Holy Spirit, actively is the one who gives us and makes known these knowledge, these ideas that are known into our human brains. And so these are foundations of theology that, well, Bavinck puts it this way: the Father, through the Son as Logos, imparts himself to his creatures in the Spirit. And so these are the underlying assumptions behind the Christian scientific foundation. And it's going to be very interesting because this is going to be challenged. And we cannot push beyond that with our fellow worldview folks who differ with us, who think that the world is a different place. We can't push with them scientifically. And so what an interesting distinction that is. Now, Chuck, did I lay that next portion out? And where do you think that's going to tend to go? And then, of course, we're going to get into where Bavinck has outlined the survey of history has gone with these principles.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part as he walks through sort of the history of all this beyond merely just the sort of the prolegomena and the foundations of thought. And I think as we've noted previously, we'll see that Bavinck is really he has a deep understanding of the world around him and the ways of thinking of the world around him. And not only has he done a really nice job here in this section on the foundations of thought of laying out those foundations and describing them, as you point out, those three foundations for the way that we think about theology. But then he moves into sections on rationalism and empiricism and realism and sort of how each of those ways of thinking have a different set of foundations that then betrays why it is that they end up in particular directions and why they come to certain conclusions about things. And he compares and contrasts those with these three foundations or principia that he's set forth here in this chapter. And so it really is a very helpful introductory course, or not even introductory, but a graduate level introductory course into not only what are the scientific foundations of theology, but even to some extent, what are the scientific foundations of other ways of thinking, and what are the various foundations that have undergirded how people think about various ideas and various modes of of being and modes of believing, and why really there is essentially a religious character to all of this, because what is really, what's really there are differences about the very basics of how do we think about things, and to some extent that has very much a religious character. We don't always think about the idea of the scientific method being in some ways a religious principle, but in many ways, especially for those for whom the scientific method is the only possible way of learning and discovering truth, well, that's a religious principle, and Bavinck, I think, lays that bare.
Chuck, I think you've hit on something very important there, and that is this assertion: we, you and I, as well as other Reformed dogmaticians, we are asserting a scientific foundation for religious dogma that is religious in character. Generally, less received is the idea that when other people, non-Christians, put forward their scientific understandings about reality, that they themselves are also engaging in thoughts of a religious character. The idea of understanding reality in, for example, modern ways, especially in light of the liberal humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften that we've been talking about, there's this idea that that's somehow the default view, that that's somehow the secular view. And the point is whenever you look at it closely, you start to realize that there are what can only charitably be described as religious presuppositions imposed upon that whole entire situation. Now, think back to our arch of Aristotle. So think of the St. Louis Arch. At the top of the St. Louis Arch, where the arch turns from its one foundation that comes up from the ground and goes downward into its second location, you have this idea of one arch being the attempt to impose mental order on the changing world of perceptions and representations. So in other words, this idea of what Bavinck calls rationalism. And so rationalism is the use of the mind to impose some ordering, some understanding, create meaning of this changing world of perceptions and representations. So mind is the key here. Now, where this gets into difficulty is if the mind is the superior place where meaning is generated, then as Bavinck notes, there's this tendency and danger for some form of idealism to gain the upper hand, in which only the thought is judged to be real. What's that mean? Well, that's a fancy way of saying that knowledge must go through the human rational faculty. And what are the limitations of that? Well, we're going to talk about that. Now, there's another approach that takes a different and opposing view, and that is that it is the sense perceptions, that they themselves alone are the source for human knowledge. Now, the mind is much less of a faculty defining what reality is. Rather, the human consciousness is subject to this world that exists outside of us. And so you have these two arches coming up and joining at the top. And this represents, to a large degree, how most contemporary philosophers and epistemologists in the modern sense will articulate what it means to be alive, what it means to be human in a universe. And so this is the starting point that all of us have to consider. And I think Bavinck is right to say from upfront that the lack or let me rephrase it this way, the pretense that these modern conceptions are not religious is one of the great gaffes of the modern liberal inquiry. And with that in mind, it's just simply a few quick thought experiments that really shows us how true that is. On the one hand, we talked about the brain in the vat situation. What can the mind do to penetrate the universe outside itself? Well, we've got two limiting factors. We've got the ability of the mind itself to think and to rationalize. And then we have the limitation on the inputs that are presented. In other words, the sensory information. Now, you can think of it this way, Chuck. If I don't have the gift of eyesight, then my understanding of reality is quite different from you, who has that gift, has that sense. And so we talk about these five senses, these empirical senses. And the truth is that they modulate reality to us on the empirical side. And then the mind itself modulates meaning and understanding on the idealistic and rationalistic side. But in both cases, if we are finite and limited, then we are trying to see into another room, Chuck, by going up to the door that separates our reality from the rest of reality and looking through the keyhole. And that's a pretty concerning thing. Well, I think we've got more to go to, and it's worth getting into the specifics of historically who thought what and why and how this works throughout history. But at least we wanted to talk about at a high level these ideas of Bavinck's understanding, the intensely religious character of the model Bavinck proposes, as well as the modern Geisteswissenschaften and the unacknowledged religious character of this Aristotelian arch of rationalism and empiricism that it presupposes. So that leaves us with a lot more to talk about. Chuck, any final thoughts as we want to wrap it up here for this discussion?
Yeah, I think this has been a good discussion, and there's so much more that we could deal with. It's interesting that just today I was reading a little bit of a debate between two folks who were on an email listserv that I think touches on some of the ideas that we're dealing with here, and touches on them in ways that, and this is a intra-Christian and intra-Reformed even debate about some of these basics of how do we study who God is. One of the people in the debate was arguing that for the idea of a self-contained ontological trinity. And by that, he means just a way of referencing a God who is in his nature both triune and immutable, unchanging, but also existing outside of created time and space. And he ties that to some of the ideas of Cornelius Van Til and Gerhardus Voss. And on the other side, who was saying, yeah, okay, that's all very interesting, but you've got this attempt to be sure that God is as ontologically disconnected as possible from creation and time and space, turns God into sort of a distant, self-contained deity that's more a God of the philosophers than of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it's interesting that very, and I didn't get into all of the various pieces of that debate, but it's interesting that even that intra-Reformed discussion about the nature of God really relates back to a lot of the issues that Bavinck is talking about here. And how is it what are the first principles that we use? How do we think about God, and how do we determine the right way to think about God? So I'm looking forward to spending a little more time with this chapter. I think there's more to discuss coming up, and I'm looking forward to it.